A bolt of lightning, like a cracked bone, split the sky over Manaus just as all the lights went out in the Asada Garuda prison. The darkness had barely suffocated the corridors when the lights came back on, but now the lamps emitted a dim blue light, as if someone had stirred up a deep sea somewhere beneath them. The siren did not work. The prisoners fell silent, breathing in the air that suddenly smelled of burnt caramel. Then, in the very heart of the complex, Section A, there was a second, even more unbearable crackling sound, as if someone, standing close to the bars, was hitting them with red-hot chains. The cells opened by themselves, the springs broke, the lock spat out the keys onto the concrete, and in the semi-darkness something completely impossible was heard, children's laughter, loud and happy, as if someone in this concrete belly was celebrating a birthday. Marcial, Carapuz, Diaz was not one to be easily surprised. But even he felt an icy lump move in his stomach as a wave of warm air, smelling of circus smoke and burnt rubber, rolled onto his doorstep. The laughter bounced off the walls, multiplied, becoming a chorus, and then suddenly stopped, as if some invisible conductor had whipped the air with a whip. The silence lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. During this time, a fresh crack appeared in the ceiling above Carapuz, from which black, dry, ash-like liquid poured out. It touched the floor and, contrary to common sense, began to spread up the walls, writing the letters LIBERDADE. At the far end of the block, something exploded, the bathroom door flew off its hinges, and the concrete roared like a living creature. When the light faded for the second time, Marcial was already standing. He pulled a homemade knife from under his bunk and took a step where instinct told him to go, into the very mouth of chaos, where between the claps of thunder someone with the voice of a child and the shadow of a monster walked freely. The world was just beginning its bloodiest carnival. Cell A18 was famous for 2 things, the mold that painted green archipelagos on the walls, and Marcial Diaz, who was nicknamed Carapuz for his eyes. The nickname appeared as a mockery. Diaz came to the world as a 30-year-old giant born of fear and distrust. 7 feet tall, hands, as if the armor had been cut, and view that can stop the heartbeat. The main thing, he never laughed. Even when on Christmas Eve the garrison was brought bags of sweet cassava, Marcial just pursed his lips so that the bones under the skin turned white. So when a slightly cool breath touched his cheek, Carapuz didn't move from places. He sat hunched over a rough wooden chessboard carved directly into the figures were from soap bars, and pawns were replaced by nails. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A child was standing near the door in a white and yellow harlequin costume. Children in Brazilian prisons? Impossible. But the boy nodded, as if inviting him to follow him. Valinho's guard, who was on duty that night, would swear later, the cell remained tightly locked. When the world around Carapuz shuddered, he jumped. A vibration ran through the floor, like an underground wave. From deep inside the building came a muffled rumble, like a ceiling collapsing. The alarm did not go off. Resounded, as if the prison had swallowed itself, trying not to awaken the distant world for concrete. The little boy glanced at the door. From behind it, a fog slowly drifted, imbued with the smell of roasted coffee. The fog was not would be enough be. He put a nail in the pawn pocket and took a step. Behind the door, the corridor was lit by amber lamps. A red strobe, which was an hour earlier, cut the floor. And with warm water mixed with blood oozed from that scar. In Brazilian prisons, blood is always present. But for this time the rule was broken. Someone killed 2 guards in sandblocks, carving the word Liberdade on their chests. Someone, or something. The little boy stepped barefoot on the smooth tile, and in the ears a dizzying melody echoed around him, as if everything around him had turned into old carnival. At the door of the sanitary block he met with Ricardo Pereira, capo of the PCC, the most powerful bandera, Primero Comando de Capital. If Carapuz controlled fear, Ricardo controlled chaos. His short fists were rumored to be filled with sand from Copacabana Beach. Every blow left of the enemy's body is tiny dunes. Ricardo smiled. Then did you cut them out? Asked Carapuz, unlocking the knife crumpled with ribbon. If only was I've already listened to their serenades in hell, Pereira replied. Something is walking through our corridors. You heard children's laughter? The little boy nodded. Pereira pulled out pocket a small starfish, a piece of soap, cut into in the shape of a trident. He who saw a trident in Garud besieged, knew, this a sign of the ancient cult of the Domars, which brought from their slave traders from Benin. Today, Domar's night, Pereira whispered. They say, in such at night, the concrete swallows the keys. The roar of the siren did break the darkness around 2 o'clock. But by the time reinforcements arrived, Carapuz was already fighting with people, and with memory. Rains on his native Alagoas was beaten the tin roof so that it seemed, the sky chose the earth. In 13 he excerpt from the dirty ditch of a small jaguar that broke his paw. The boy brought the animal to barn, wrapped it in an old t-shirt with the number 10. When his father, drunk on cachaca, found them, the jaguar was already asleep, its head resting on the Marcial's shoulder. The father pulled out a knife, and everything that the boy remembered further, the smell of blood, were the beast and the man. That night he learned to distinguish between 3 types of screams, from pain, from fear, and from contempt. Ian cited, Carapuz heard these screams every day. But this time they sounded as if they were echoed. The lights flickered like broken fireflies, and in the shadows of the passages, someone, or something, moved without steps, only sighing. The little boy reached the forks, right, stairs to libraries, left, the kitchen block. The kitchen was now burning like a paella from hell, pots were exploding, salt was melting in the air, and the silhouettes of rats skipped through the flames. He chose the library because there was silence, the only currency he had appreciated. The skeleton of the bloody guard hung on the chains instead of chandeliers. On black lilies of mold bloomed on the shelves. And amidst that stench, the book fell from shelves right under his feet. O Guarani is a novel by José de Alencar about honor and sacrifice. Inside, someone had drawn the coordinates with a pencil, -3.103 degrees sh, -60.017 degrees etc., and signed, Clava Sins. The little boy wiped the bloody plaques from face and he hid the book under his shirt. His instincts whispered, the coordinates were not about escape. This about the revelation of something even more terrible than freedom. Towards morning the prison fell silent, like a beast that had eaten its own tails. The dead lay in each other's arms. Scattered spring door mechanisms. With wires hung from the ceiling, and the child's laughter, that first one, was reflected in dozens of entries on the guards who remained alive swore. On the footage shows a pale boy holding a hand's key and smiles broadly. However, on a black background he should not have 2 and 4 eyes. The little boy stood in the edge of the courtyard, where the dawn sky promised stifling heat. The fear he felt never knew, licked his insides for the first time. In his hand was clutching a piece of Trident soap, a souvenir of Pereira, who had disappeared somewhere that night. Marcial felt that this thing is not amulet, and key. The key to coordinates, to an insurmountable mystery that confuses prison walls with a labyrinth of living flesh. The story of Carapuz was just beginning. Ahead awaited a meeting with the mysterious Domar, the trials of carnival night and bloody games with memory. Yes, even he not yet knew that the Real hunt will begin in by the standards of a world where prison bars are just the first note. As the sun rose rapidly above the Amazonian treetops and melted the darkness of night, a deceptive silence fell over the Garud siege. It seemed as if the prison corridors had grown tired of screaming and were now holding their breath. But Marcial, Carapuz, Diaz heard what the others did not, the whisper of steel. Every bolt, every beam hummed like a harp with a broken wing, sending each other the message, it's not over yet. The prison plan that Carapuz had memorized contained a secret. Under the sanitary block lay an old technical tunnel, forgotten after the modernization 20 years ago. It was large enough for 2 people to walk through side by side, and confusing enough to turn into a labyrinth. It was there that the fresh trail of blood, still steaming in the morning heat, led. The little boy dove into a dark hole, behind which a metal staircase descended into the seething stomach of the complex. On the second flight, he came across a salute of long-abandoned magazines. The yellow pages of Veja and Playcar covered the floor like dry leaves. In the refracted light of the lantern, the printed faces of the football players seemed like carved masks that went numb when you stepped on them. Ahead, several figures loomed. The little boy recognized the dwarfish figure of Baptista Alvarez, nicknamed Escovedo, who sat in the medical unit all the time, feigning an ulcer to avoid work. Next to him was Tatian, Pastor Souza, a former Baptist preacher who had shot his wife on the night of the exorcism. Their foreheads were glistening with cold sweat. Did you see his eyes? Escovedo trembled slightly. I saw it, agreed the pastor. He has 4, like seraphim. There are 6 seraphim, corrected Carapuz, stepping out of the shadows. And this little one is not an angel. From above came the dull roar of transformers. The sounds merged into a pulse that echoed in his temples. The little boy understood, the tunnel led to the central power unit. If the power went out there, the sighted would turn into a stone cave, then the one who controls the children's laughter would receive absolute darkness. Let's go, he commanded. If the light goes out, we're dead. The power unit's airlocks were like a nocturne for rusty pianos, each creak singing a new note of menace. Carapuz and his companions slid along the steamy pipes, through which rivers of steam boiled. In the center of the hall stood the generator drum, a giant cylinder that slowly spun, throwing out sparks. On the floor lay Isadora Lamy, a young trainee supervisor, about to go on her first night's patrol, on the night of Domar. Her pulse remained, but her body was paralyzed, her eyes were wandering under her eyelids. The pastor knelt, whispering a psalm. The little boy raised the lantern to Isadora's face and saw on her pale lips the bloody word, clavis. "The key," whispered Escovedo. "She says, the key." "The question is where," grumbled Carapuz. Suddenly the generator shuddered and stopped spinning. The bulbs went out one by one, and as darkness fell, the echo of children's footsteps was born in the agaphone of metal. From the shadows he emerged, a pale harlequin boy, outlined with a bluish luminescence, as if made of the same light that had drowned in the lamps. His mouth opened to his ears in a smile, and in his palms he cracked a small but terribly loud whip. "The leper carnival begins," the child sang. In response, the pipes exploded, jets of steam burst from the nozzles, from which the skin was covered with burns in an instant. The pastor was carried away by the blow, Escovedo screamed, but Carapuz, uttering an old sailor's curse, rushed forward. He pulled Isadora off the floor, covering her with his back. The steam burned his shoulders, but he stood like a rock. But the boy was not the target. His gaze changed angle. He looked past Carapuz, at the large control panel. The power unit diagram flashed on the screen, and in the center a red circle pulsated with the caption, "Chave Principal, Main Key." "Damn it," Carapuz cursed. The main disconnector. The generator, without power, was still running in reverse, but it would cool down completely in a few minutes. Carapuz helped Isadora to her feet. "Point where it's red," he ordered. "Quick!" She shuddered, waking from the darkness, and the lump of fear in her throat finally burst into a scream. But her hands worked. The harlequin child threw back her head, and Carapuz saw that the boy's eyes were changing. The pupils were growing, becoming, no, not circles, but gears. He swallows mechanics, Carapuz understood. Isadora hit the button. The circuit breakers clanged, and an electrical storm awoke in the hall. The light flashed, bright as the midday sun. Nothing remained of the child except a piece of yellow and white cloth smoldering on the hot metal. The generator roared again, letting life return to the siege. Carapuz felt the rumble of metal pass through his bones, binding him to this iron fortress. He realized that the key was not only mechanical, any act of will directed against fear could become the key. Any success in prison is simply an invitation to greater danger. As Carapuz, Isadora, and the steam-scarred pastor climbed back up the tunnel, they walked a private path of confessions. The pastor said that a week ago, at night, he had seen a bizarre ritual in the chapel, for convicts, members of the Forbidden Brotherhood of Domar, cutting their hands and spilling their blood on the concrete, drawing a map of the world, but with changing continents that died and grew under a fiery cry. In the center of the map was an island with 4 towers, a symbol of the 4 eyes. They said it was a book written by blood year after year, the pastor wheezed. And the last page will be written by a child. The little boy checked his pocket. Pereira's trident was still there. With the blade of his knife, he scraped off a barely visible mark on the reverse, the intertwined letters D and M, Domar and Manaus? No, he felt, the mystery was deeper. Escovedo, who had barely spoken until now, began to babble ahead. "I remember where I saw the boy," he whispered. "In the old newspapers. 10 years ago, 6 children disappeared on the outskirts of Manaus. Witnesses said they were led away by a shadow that looked very much like a harlequin child." The words hung in the air like flies over a wound. Carapuz felt cold sweat gather between his shoulder blades. A few corridors away, a rumble could be heard. It was another part of the prison waking up. The jailers were lining up the prisoners, trying to figure out what had happened during the night. But the underground war remained invisible. Suddenly, from the subject, as if from under the floor, came a quiet childish voice. "You will never find the right page without a hint." A gap opened up in front of Carapuz, and on the other side all he could see was emptiness. But in the emptiness, a bony structure slowly emerged, as if someone were building a web out of collarbones and ribs strung together. This web formed a pattern similar to the plan of siege, but with secret rooms at the edges. "A map made of bones," Isadora breathed. The little boy remembered every turn. When the image disappeared, he realized there was a second labyrinth, one inside the other, like a nesting doll. Whoever passed it would reach the route where the caretaker was hiding. At noon, the occidental began to sway. It was as if the entire complex had been placed on a record and someone had started spinning it faster and faster. The concrete walls rumbled, a resonance of forces that should not have been left between the barbed wire. Escape is the ghost word that every prisoner whispers before going to sleep. Today it has gained muscle. The main courtyard is already filled with a crowd. PCC, Familia do Norte, small gangs and loners stood side by side because there were no more cells to separate them. The guards, not having enough tear gas, took cover in the towers, and above everyone's heads, like ghosts, stood 4 searchlights. The light wave from them doubled, the lenses must have cracked from the heat. Carapuz, Pastor, Isadora, and Escovedo climbed onto the balcony of the disciplinary block, from where they could see the courtyard like the palm of their hand. And it was there, in the heart of the group, that Marcial saw the familiar face of Pereira. Ricardo held in his hand something that looked like the core of a lock, and a dozen eyes were glued to it like a tentacle. "Toddler!" Pereira shouted. "Your key, brother. Get up!" Marcial felt, the choice was not between freedom and submission. The choice was between the mundaneness of human fear and the black gravity well that Domar had opened. To flee was to let the monster out of prison with them. To stay was to defy the power that played with the bones of children. The concrete rang out high, like a giant gong. Cracks ran across it, forming a pattern of 4 circles. The little boy remembered a chessboard made of soap figures. That's a game where the figures are them, and the player sits in the shadows. "Time to head downtown," he said. "To the center of what?" Escovedo asked, frightened. Marcial smiled for the first time in years. "To the heart of Domar." The balcony of the disciplinary block had become a high platform from which a chasm opened. Under the columns of the courtyard, the concrete paving stones cracked rapidly, like an old shell, and dark red water poured into the cracks. The little boy remembered the bone map. It was here, under the main courtyard, that a hidden well lay, marked with 4 concentric circles. Those circles were now taking shape. The cracks were converging, forming a perfect circle, in the center of which something living was already seething. "It's a trap," Isadora whispered, clutching the rusty lantern in her fingers. "He wants to gather us in one place." "If we don't go down," replied Carapuz, "he'll get out himself." The moment he jumped down onto the rubble-strewn parade ground, the world shook. The pastor solemnly held out a silver cross that had miraculously survived the steam bombardment, and Escovedo held a bag of lightbulb powder, homemade explosive powder. Only Pereira remained, in whose hand the lock core gleamed, perhaps the last metal key that had not obeyed Domar's will. "We're coming with you," Pereira said shortly. The crack of the cracks grew into the roar of an earthquake. The center of the courtyard shifted down, revealing a shaft of reinforced steel. It blew cold and dust of antiquity. Carapuz felt the walls of the giant well sing, a low-frequency hum glued bones. His heart lost its rhythm. It was Domar's voice. 4 eyes, 4 levels, he whispered to himself and moved down the first brackets, as if he had imagined this all his life. The first level, the Eye of Pain, greeted them with fire. The narrow corridor burned, not with flames, but with memories. Scenes of each of their past sufferings flowed down the walls. Carapuz saw his father with a knife and his slowly dying jaguar, reflected in thousands of sparkling crystals. Isadora saw his mother, who cursed her for deciding to become a guard. Pereira saw his lost brother, killed in a police raid. The pastor was burned by a vision of his wife with a hole in her chest. "These are illusions," Carapuz croaked, but his voice was breaking. He stepped through his own shame, and the memories scattered like heat to the floor. The others eventually followed him. The corridor faded, receding. The second, Eye of Fear, opened into a hall with mirrored walls. In the reflections they saw themselves, but with the features of monsters: Carapuz, a giant with steel claws; Pereira, a bloodthirsty jackal; Isadora, a puppet with cut strings; Pastor, a black-winged demon. Fear took a step towards him, but Carapuz stuck his own nail pawn into the cold glass. "If you show me my ugly self," he croaked, "watch how I take it." The crack sprinkled dust on the mirror. Darkness flared behind it. The third, Eye of Vina, was silence. No visions tormented, only a stone hall with a single pedestal. On it was the icy mask of a harlequin child. Around the mask lay metal parts like puzzles, springs, gears, valves. Escovedo, stammering, assembled them, repeating in a daze that he had once worked as a watchmaker. With a sure hand, he inserted the last gear, and the mask came to life. 4 slits appeared in it, from which light was supposed to breathe. "Are you ready?" whispered the pastor, but he heard no answer. Escovedo leaned forward, giving the mask a breath, and the metal teeth bloomed red. The sharp flower tore open his throat. He rolled to the floor, and the blood painted a crescent moon. "The sacrifice is accepted," a voice purred from the air. "The gates of the heart are open." The fourth, Eye of the Heart, opened into a vast hall, like a cathedral, but with walls of concrete and rebar. In the center was a mechanical throne, on which sat the caretaker himself. He was no boy. The harlequin child was merely a mask through which an alien ancient core spoke. His true form collapsed in smoke and light, a body of bones and gears, 4 eye ports, each with a spinning shadow. The pain has taken over and made it fuel," Domar growled. "Fear has melted into the chains that hold this house together. Have you come to break them?" Show me the keys and I will grant you freedom. Pereira lifted the lock core. Isadora, a lantern, which now shone with a bloody white flame. The pastor pulled out a cross. Carapuz waved his soapy trident, and blood spurted from the wound in his shoulder. It fell on the soap, and suddenly the trident shone, as if drunk with the salt of life. The key is us, said Carapuz. And we do not sell ourselves. The first bolt of lightning struck between the ceiling and the throne. The janitor raised his hand, the stick sprouting from the floor, aiming for Pereira's chest. The pastor threw himself, his back to the steel, piercing him through, but the cross fell from his hands, sending a spark into a storm of energy swirling above the hall. The spark lit Isadora's lantern even brighter. Pereira jumped to his side and with a damp tear in his cloak, revealed the PCC tattoo on his chest. He loaded the core into the socket on the throne. In an instant, the hall was filled with the clatter of chains. The mechanisms moved in the opposite direction. The throne, as if responding with pain, rose on its gears. Dishonor, Domar shouted, changing from a boy to a bone titan. I am the heart of the bars, and the bars are your home. The little boy knew it was his last move. He raised the trident and remembered the chessboard, the soap figures, the pawn of the nail. In his hand the trident split into 3 blades, shining with white and burning heat. The caretaker threw 4 promenades at him: fear, pain, guilt, temptation. The little boy responded with 3 blows, each one missed the vichaports. A convulsive roar shook the dungeon. The beams connected to the throne began to split. Pereira pulled the dead pastor, Isadora supported him. The debris fell, shattering the floor, and Carapuz, cursing his fatigue, threw the trident into the very mouth of the Domar. The white blade entered the mechanical heart, and from that heart a crack went to every wall. The key accepts the sacrifice, Escovedo's voice whispered, as if from out of this world. The prison of Ostal Garuda stood empty. The sun rose over the ruins, the concrete towers had collapsed and the barbed wire had slipped into the mud. Rescuers found only 5 alive: Isadora, several ordinary prisoners, and Ricardo Pereira, whose hands were torn off. Marcial, Carapuz, Diaz was gone. There were legends about him. Some saw him emerge from the ground a kilometer from the prison, carrying a soapy trident in his dirty hands, now with emptiness instead of blades. Others swore they had seen him on the banks of the Rio Negro, watching the reflection of 4 blinded eyes fade in the water. In the field hospital ward, Isadora woke up at midnight to the sound of intermittent splashing water. The exhausting heat was pouring in through the open window, but under her pillow she found a chess pawn and a nail. Next to it lay a tiny note: Liberdade. When she looked up, the window was empty. Only in the darkness could be faintly heard the echo of laughter, not childish, but human, dull, and victorious. They say that in the depths of the Amazon jungle, you can sometimes hear concrete singing. But that singing no longer calls for fear. It resembles the heartbeat of a giant learning to laugh.